They say money talks, but silence is what you hear when it leaves. On Tuesday morning, Jason Thorne was the 24th richest man in Manhattan, a fintech god who moved millions with a single keystroke. By Tuesday evening, he didn't just lose his fortune. He lost his existence. No accounts, no home, no friends. He was erased. But in the darkest corner of a rainy city, a waitress named Elizabeth didn't see a fallen tycoon. She saw a broken man. What she handed him wasn't just a cup of coffee. It was a secret that would burn his empire to the ground and rebuild it from the ashes. This is the story of how $1 billion vanished in a heartbeat, and how a waitress changed history in seconds. Jason Thorne didn't look at prices. He looked at value, and he looked at time. At 36 years old, the CEO of Ethelgard Capital had optimized every second of his life. His morning coffee was an Ethiopian blend, sourced exclusively for him, prepared by a personal barista who knew exactly 83 degrees Celsius was the optimal brewing temperature. His suits were bespoke Anderson and Shepherd, cut to hide the tension in his shoulders. On October 14th, Jason stood in his corner office on the 54th floor of the Hudson Yards Tower, overlooking the steel-grey Hudson River. He was waiting for a confirmation email from Magnus Vane, his CFO and oldest friend from their days at Wharton. They were about to close the Project Omega merger, a deal that would cement Ethelgard as the primary infrastructure for the new digital banking system in Europe. It was a $4 billion handshake. Mr. Thorne. Jason didn't turn around. He recognized the hesitant click of his assistant, Stella's heels. "Do we have the signature, Stella?" "No, sir. There are men here, from the DOJ and the SEC. Jason frowned, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "I don't have a meeting with regulators. Send them to legal on the 12th floor." "They aren't asking for a meeting, Jason." The voice was deep, unfamiliar, and came from the doorway. Jason turned. 3 men in windbreakers with bold yellow lettering stood there. Behind them, 2 uniformed officers. "Jason Thorne," the lead agent said, stepping onto the plush Persian rug. "I'm Special Agent Miller. We have a warrant for the seizure of all assets related to Ethelgard Capital and your personal estates, pursuant to the RICO Act." Jason laughed. It was a dry, incredulous sound. "RICO? That's for mobsters, Agent Miller. I run a quantitative hedge fund. Call Magnus Vane. He handles compliance." "Mr. Vane is currently in custody," Miller said, his face unreadable. "He's been cooperating with us for 6 months. He alleges you were the architect of the Ponzi structure hidden behind the Omega algorithm." The room seemed to tilt. The air conditioning hummed, suddenly deafening. "Magnus? Cooperating?" "That's a lie," Jason said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I wrote the code. Magnus just sells it. Hand over your phone and laptop, Mr. Thorne. Now." In the span of 20 minutes, Jason was escorted out of his own building. He wasn't arrested. Not yet. They needed to process the indictment. But they did something worse. They initiated a total asset freeze. As he stood on the sidewalk of 10th Avenue, the humiliation began. He reached for his phone to call his lawyer, Arthur Penhaligon, the best defense attorney in the city. The screen was black. Remote wipe. He flagged down his driver, who was idling at the curb in the Maybach. The driver, a man Jason had employed for 5 years, looked at him through the glass, then looked at the federal agents swarming the building lobby. The driver locked the doors. "Open the door. Verify code 992, Jason commanded, tapping the glass. The driver shook his head, looking genuinely apologetic, and pulled away, merging into the uncaring yellow stream of taxis. Jason reached into his pocket. He had his titanium American Express Centurion card and a money clip with perhaps $200 in cash. He walked to the nearest ATM to withdraw cash, just in case. Card declined. Contact issuer. He tried his backup Visa. Card seized by federal order. He checked the cash in his clip. Empty. He must have given the cash to the valet at dinner last night and forgotten to replenish it. It started to rain. Not a dramatic storm, but a cold, miserable New York drizzle that soaked into the fine wool of his suit. Jason Thorne, a man who possessed $3 billion in assets at 9 a.m., stood on a street corner at 11:30 a.m. with $0, no phone, no coat, and a looming indictment for a crime he didn't commit. He needed to get to his penthouse in Tribeca. He had a safe there. Gold Krugerrands, emergency cash, a burner phone. He walked. It took him 2 hours in the rain. When he arrived at the private elevator entrance of his building, the biometric scanner flashed red. Access denied. Resident evicted per court order 44B. The doorman, a man named Henry, whom Jason had tipped $5,000 last Christmas, stood behind the glass. "Henry!" Jason shouted, the desperation finally cracking his voice. "Let me in. I just need to get to my safe." Henry looked down at his shoes, then turned his back, walking into the mailroom. Jason pounded on the glass until his knuckles bled. Nothing. He was a ghost. Magnus Vane hadn't just framed him. He had orchestrated an immediate, surgical erasure of Jason's life. Night fell. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees. Jason, shivering, hungry, and delirious with rage, wandered aimlessly north. He couldn't go to a hotel. He couldn't call a friend. He was radioactive. By 1 a.m., the billionaire was huddled under the awning of a closed, dry cleaner in the East Village, the smell of wet garbage and exhaust fumes filling his lungs. He was just another shadow in the city. Hunger is a sensation Jason hadn't truly felt in decades. He felt appetite, sure, a desire for seared scallops or Wagyu beef. But this was different. This was a gnawing, acidic pain in his stomach that made his hands shake. He kept walking to stay warm. The neon signs of the city blurred into streaks of red and blue. He found himself on a quieter street in the Lower East Side, a neighborhood he hadn't visited since he was a grad student hustling for internships. Halfway down the block, a flickering yellow sign buzzed. Sal's Moonlight Diner, open 24 hours. It wasn't retro chic. It was just old. The windows were steamed up, and the smell of frying onions and stale coffee wafted out every time the door opened. Jason hesitated. He had no money, but the warmth radiance coming from the glass was irresistible. "I am Jason Thorne," he told himself, straightening his damp jacket. "I can negotiate. I will offer them an IOU. I will promise them $10,000 for a sandwich once my accounts are cleared." He pushed the door open. A bell jingled. The diner was mostly empty. An elderly man slept in a back booth. A couple of cab drivers argued quietly at the counter. "Sit anywhere, hun. I'll be right with you." The voice was raspy, but warm. Jason slid into a booth near the back. The red vinyl cracked and taped over with silver duct tape. He wiped the rain from his face with a paper napkin. A waitress approached. She looked tired. Her name tag read Elizabeth. She was perhaps 28, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and curly hair pulled back in a messy, utilitarian bun. Her uniform was clean but frayed at the collar. She dropped a laminated menu on the table. "Coffee?" "Yes," Jason said. "Black and water." "Coming up," she returned quickly, pouring a steaming mug of dark liquid. It wasn't Ethiopian blend. It smelled burnt. To Jason, it smelled like heaven. He drank it in one long, scalding gulp. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Rough night?" "You could say that," Jason muttered. He looked at the menu. A burger was 12 dollars. A grilled cheese was 8 dollars. He looked up at her. He had to do it. Miss Elizabeth, Jason started, putting on his best boardroom voice, though it wavered. I find myself in a temporary liquidity crisis. My wallet has been misplaced. However, I am Jason Thorne. If you provide me with a meal, I can write you a promissory note for $5,000, payable within 48 hours. Elizabeth stared at him. She looked at his soaked, expensive suit, the Patek Philippe watch, which he hadn't thought to pawn yet, and his desperate eyes. She didn't look impressed. She looked sad. Honey, she said softly, we don't take promissory notes. And Sal, the owner, he's in the back. If he finds out you can't pay, he calls the cops. He's strict about the vagrants. I am not a vagrant, Jason snapped, his pride stinging. I am the CEO of Ethelgard Capital. Elizabeth paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Ethelgard? The ones who just bought out the devastating housing loans in Queens? Jason blinked. We acquire distressed assets, yes. Distressed assets, she repeated, the warmth vanishing from her voice. That's what you call my grandmother's apartment building? You people raised the rent by 200% last month. We're being evicted next week. Jason froze. The macroeconomic strategy he viewed on spreadsheets, optimizing yield from undervalued property portfolios, had a face, and the face was looking at him with a mixture of pity and resentment. Jason stammered. I didn't handle that division personally. Doesn't matter, does it? Elizabeth sighed. She took the coffee pot to pull it away. Look, mister, you need to leave. If Sal sees you occupying a booth without paying, please, Jason whispered. The arrogance broke. He slumped against the vinyl. I haven't eaten since yesterday. I have nowhere to go. They took everything. Elizabeth looked down at him. She saw the tremor in his hands. She saw the distinct look of a man who had hit the bottom so fast the wind had been knocked out of him. She looked toward the kitchen where Sal was shouting at the cook. She bit her lip. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, her tips from the last hour. Grilled cheese and fries, she said, her voice low. I'm putting it in, but you eat fast and you get out before Sal notices you're still dripping on his floor. Jason looked at the money in her hand. It was more real value than the billions he had commanded that morning. Why? He asked. If I'm the enemy? Because my brother is sick, she said, staring past him out the window. And he told me that hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'm not saving you, Mr. Thorne. I'm just feeding a hungry human. She turned and walked to the kitchen. Jason sat in silence. 10 minutes later, she placed a plate in front of him. It was greasy, hot, and piled high. As he ate, wolfing down the food with zero dignity, Elizabeth sat opposite him, counting her tips on the table. She had a textbook open next to her. Advanced Cryptography and Network Security. Jason stopped chewing. He wiped his mouth. You're studying cryptography? Elizabeth didn't look up. Trying to. Night school. I need a better job to pay for Leo's meds. But this... She tapped a page full of complex equations. I'm stuck on the blockchain hashing sequence. It doesn't make sense. Jason leaned forward. He recognized the equation. It was a derivative of the Esche 256 algorithm, the very foundation he had built Ethelgard's security protocols on. It's not the sequence that's wrong, Jason said, his voice finding its old confidence. It's your variable for the nonce. You're treating it as a static integer. In a dynamic chain, it has to be a floating hexadecimal. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes wide. What? Give me a pen, Jason said. She handed him a cheap Bic ballpoint. He grabbed a paper napkin and began to write, scribbling furiously. "Look," he said, turning the napkin around. "If you solve for x here, the loop closes. That's how you verify the block." Elizabeth stared at the napkin. Her mouth opened slightly. "You just solved the final exam question in 30 seconds. "I wrote the code that this textbook is based on," Jason said. Elizabeth looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Not as a suit, not as a vagrant, but as a mind. "If you're that smart," she whispered, "how did you let them take everything?" "I trusted the wrong person," Jason said darkly. "Magnus Vane." At the mention of the name, Elizabeth dropped her pen. It clattered loudly on the table. Her face went pale. "Magnus Vane?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes. My CFO. Why?" Elizabeth reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "Because," she said, sliding it across the table. "2 days ago, a man came here. He was drunk. He left this behind. I didn't open it because it said confidential, and I thought he'd come back. His credit card name was Magnus Vane." Jason stared at the envelope. It was stamped with the Ethelgard logo, but it had a red "Eyes Only" stamp that Jason had never used. "Open it," Elizabeth said. Jason tore the envelope open. Inside was a single flash drive and a printed flight itinerary for a private jet leaving Teterboro Airport for the Cayman Islands. The date on the ticket was tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. But it was the notepaper clipped to the ticket that made Jason's blood run cold. "Protocol 0 ready. Thorne takes the fall on Tuesday. Assets liquidate to the offshore shell by Friday. Thanks for the help, Dad." Jason looked up. "Dad?" Elizabeth was reading the note upside down. She let out a choked sob. "What is it?" Jason asked. "My father," Elizabeth whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "My father is the head of security for Ethelgard. His name is Frank Rossi. He told me he was working on a big retirement bonus." The silence in the diner was heavy. "Your father and my partner are stealing $4 billion, Jason said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "And they're using me as the scapegoat." Elizabeth looked at the napkin with the equation, then at the flash drive. She grabbed the drive and clenched it in her fist. "My dad kicked me out 3 years ago," she said, her voice hardening. "He abandoned Leo when he got sick. He said sick kids were a drain on resources." She looked at Jason. "You need a computer," she said. "I don't have one. Mine is seized." Elizabeth stood up, untying her apron. "Shifts over. I have a laptop at my place. It's slow and the screen is cracked, but it connects to the internet." "Elizabeth," Jason said, standing up. "If we do this, if we access that drive, we are committing a felony. They are watching for my digital signature." "Then don't use your signature," she said, grabbing her coat. "Teach me how to use mine." Jason looked at the waitress. In seconds, the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't saving him with a grilled cheese sandwich anymore. She was offering him a weapon. "Lead the way," Jason said. The subway ride to Queens was a blur of fluorescent lights and suspicious glances. Jason sat squeezed between a man smelling of plaster dust and a woman clutching 2 grocery bags. He kept his head down, staring at his handmade Italian shoes, which were now scuffed and splashed with mud. Elizabeth lived in Jackson Heights, in a pre-war brick building that had seen better decades. The elevator was out of order. They walked up 5 flights of stairs. Jason, fit from squash and Pilates, found himself winded, not from exertion, but from the sheer weight of the stress pressing on his chest. "It's small," Elizabeth warned as she unlocked the door with 3 different keys. "And Leo is sleeping, so keep it down." The apartment was a shoebox. The living room doubled as a dining room and study. But it was clean. Books were stacked everywhere. coding manuals, medical journals, vintage sci-fi. On the sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a thin boy of about 16 was asleep, his breathing wheezy and rhythmic. A nebulizer machine sat on the coffee table next to an array of orange pill bottles. "That's Leo," Elizabeth whispered, hanging her coat. "Cystic fibrosis. The new gene therapy drugs cost $14,000 a month. Your company's insurance arm denied our coverage request last week." Jason felt a wave of nausea. He had approved the algorithm that auto-rejected high-risk, low-yield claimants. He hadn't seen faces. He had seen data points in a spreadsheet column titled Liability Optimization. Jason started, but the words died in his throat. Apologies were useless. Fixing this was the only currency that mattered now. Elizabeth cleared a space on a small circular table and opened a battered Dell laptop. The screen flickered to life, a jagged crack running down the left side. "Okay," she said, plugging in the flash drive. "Do your magic." Jason sat on the rickety wooden chair. He cracked his knuckles. It had been years since he actually coded. He was a manager now, a vision guy, but the muscle memory of his 20s, when he built the Ethelgard kernel in a dorm room, came flooding back. He opened the terminal. The drive was encrypted with a military-grade AES 2R56 cipher. "Standard security," Jason muttered. "Magnus is lazy. He used the corporate default." He typed in a backdoor command he had installed 5 years ago for maintenance, a skeleton key he never told anyone about. "Access denied." Jason frowned. He tried again. "Access denied. Biometric token required." "He patched the back door," Jason said, slamming his fist on the table. "He knew I might try this. The drive is locked to Magnus's retina scan or his voice print." Elizabeth leaned over his shoulder. "Or maybe he's just predictable." "What do you mean?" "You said he was drunk when he left the drive. He was bragging about a retirement bonus and Protocol 0. Look at the file structure." She pointed to the metadata. "The encryption isn't random. The hash salt, it repeats." She reached over and typed a string of numbers. 10, 2023. "Today's date?" Jason asked. "No, that's the date of the merger deadline. But look at the file size. 4.2 gigabytes. That's not documents. That's a database." Elizabeth pushed Jason aside gently and took the keyboard. "You're thinking like a CEO, Jason. You're trying to use a key. I'm going to pick the lock." She didn't try to decrypt the password. Instead, she attacked the error reporting tool. She overloaded the password field with a buffer overflow script, a crude, messy hacker trick that Jason would have fired his security team for missing. The screen flashed green. System halted, dumping memory to safe mode. Suddenly, the file directory opened. "Jesus," Jason breathed. "You bypassed the encryption by crashing the gatekeeper." "Like I said," Elizabeth smirked, though her hands were shaking. "Messy." They opened the folder labeled Omega Real. It was a ledger. A shadow ledger. Jason scrolled through the lines of code and transaction histories. His eyes widened. He didn't just steal the money, he shorted the stock. "In English?" Elizabeth asked. "Magnus took out massive positions betting that Ethelgard stock would crash. Then he framed me to cause the crash. When the market opens tomorrow and the news of my arrest hits, the stock will plummet. He'll make billions on the drop and simultaneously move the company's liquid assets to the Caymans." "And my dad?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Jason scrolled down. He found a folder named Payroll Black, Frank Rossi, security consultant, $5,000 transfer pending. "He sold you out for $5 million, Jason said, "and he sold me out for the whole empire." "We have to send this to the FBI, Elizabeth said, reaching for her phone. "No." Jason grabbed her wrist. "We can't. The FBI is already building a case against me. Magnus has planted evidence that makes me look like the owner of these offshore accounts. If we send them this drive, they'll just think it's my backup. It has my digital signature all over it, because Magnus used my admin codes." "So we're screwed?" "Not yet." Jason stared at the screen. "The transfer of the company assets, the $4 billion, is scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow. It requires a physical confirmation from the secure server room." "Why physical?" "Because I set it up that way," Jason said with a grim smile. "To prevent remote hacking. To authorize a transfer that large, you have to insert a physical master key into the mainframe at the data center." "Where is the data center?" "It's not in the office," Jason said. "It's in a subterranean bunker in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. High security, biometric scanners, armed guards." "And let me guess," Elizabeth said. "The head of security is my father." "Exactly." Elizabeth looked at Leo sleeping on the couch, then at the eviction notice pinned to her refrigerator. She looked at Jason, the billionaire in the muddy suit. "If we stop the transfer," she asked, "can you fix the insurance? Can you save Leo?" Jason turned to her. He took her hands. "Elizabeth, if we pull this off, I will buy the hospital and name it after him. I swear to you." "Okay," Elizabeth exhaled. "Then we're breaking into the Navy Yard." The Brooklyn Navy Yard at 3 a.m. is a ghost town of industrial skeletons and rusting cranes. But Building 77 was different. It was a fortress of concrete and dark glass, housing the servers for some of the world's most powerful financial institutions. Jason and Elizabeth crouched behind a dumpster in the alleyway across the street. The rain had stopped, replaced by a biting wind. "There are 3 guards at the loading dock," Jason whispered, observing the rotation. "And a thermal camera above the main entrance." "We aren't going in the front," Elizabeth said. She pulled a bundle of clothes from her backpack. "Put this on." It was a grey jumpsuit with a patch that read, "Citywide Sanitation." "Where did you get this?" Jason asked, eyeing the grime on the collar. "My neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He works the graveyard shift. I borrowed it while he was sleeping. Don't worry, I left him a note and a 6-pack. "And you?" Elizabeth pulled on a similar jumpsuit, but hers was oversized, swallowing her frame. She handed Jason a mop bucket and a heavy industrial floor buffer she had dragged from the subway station. "We aren't hackers tonight, Jason. We're the cleaning crew." "They have a private cleaning contractor," Jason argued. "They won't let us in." "Shift change is at 3:30 a.m., Elizabeth said, checking her cheap digital watch. "The regular crew comes out. We go in. We just need to look like we belong." "I am the CEO. I don't look like a janitor." Elizabeth grabbed a handful of dirt from the ground and smeared it across Jason's cheek. She ruffled his perfect hair until it stood on end. "Now you do," she said. "Shoulders down, Jason. Stop walking like you own the pavement. Walk like you're tired. Walk like your feet hurt." It was the hardest acting lesson of Jason's life. He had to unlearn 30 years of posture and entitlement. He slumped. He dragged the buffer. At 3:35 a.m., a group of workers exited the side door, laughing and smoking. The door hissed slowly toward a close. "Now," Elizabeth hissed. They moved. They didn't run. Running draws attention. They walked with purpose. Jason caught the heavy steel door just before it clicked shut. They slipped into the airlock. The hallway smelled of ozone and floor wax. They made it 10 feet before a voice boomed. "Hey, you two!" Jason froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He turned slowly. A guard, hand resting on his holster, walked towards them. It wasn't just any guard. It was a man Jason recognized from company picnics, a man he had nodded to for years but never spoken to. "Badge!" the guard demanded. Jason looked down. He didn't have a badge. He was about to panic, to try and bribe the man with money he didn't have, when Elizabeth stepped forward. "Sorry, boss," she said, her accent thickening into a heavy Queen's drawl. "Dispatch sent us. Apparently some pipe burst on the 3rd floor. Glycol leak? They said it's a hazard for the servers." The guard frowned. "I didn't hear about a leak." "Yeah, well, that's why we're here." Elizabeth rolled her eyes, pointing at Jason. "This guy's new. He forgot the paperwork in the truck. You want us to go back and get it? Or you want the coolant to fry the mainframes? My boss said if those servers overheat, it's on your head." The guard hesitated. The mention of coolant and servers spooked him. He knew the machines were sensitive. "Make it quick," the guard grunted, swiping his keycard at the turnstile. "Service elevator is on the left." They walked past him. Jason felt sweat trickling down his back. "Glycol leak?" Jason whispered once they were in the elevator. "I read the safety manual online," Elizabeth shrugged. "Social engineering 101. Act annoyed, imply a crisis, and blame a supervisor." The elevator dinged at sub-level 4. The cold storage. This was the heart of the beast. The room was kept at a freezing 60 degrees. Rows of black monoliths hummed with blue LED lights. "Okay," Jason said, rushing to the central terminal. "I need 3 minutes." He sat at the console. It was air-gapped. No internet connection. This was why Magnus couldn't do it from the Caymans. This was the fail-safe. Jason began to type. He wasn't stopping the transfer. He was redirecting it. He was writing a script to bounce the funds into an escrow account controlled by the SEC, effectively freezing Magnus out. "Jason," Elizabeth whispered. "Hurry. Almost there. Step 1, authenticate. Step 2, reroute target IP." Suddenly, the elevator chimed again. Jason stopped. Elizabeth ducked behind a server rack. Heavy footsteps echoed on the metal grating. "I know you're down here, Jason." The voice was gravel and smoke. Jason stood up slowly. Frank Rossi stood at the end of the aisle. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a tailored suit that looked wrong on his bulky frame, and he was holding a silenced pistol. "Hello, Frank," Jason said, keeping his hands visible. "You're a persistent son of a bitch," Frank said, walking closer. "Magnus said you'd try to run. I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to break back in." "Magnus is playing you, Frank," Jason said calmly. "He's not going to give you 5 million. He's going to disappear to a non-extradition country, and you're going to be the one left holding the bag when the feds realize the security logs were tampered with." "Shut up," Frank snapped. "Magnus has a plan. I'm secure." "Are you?" Jason stepped forward. "Does he know about your daughter?" Frank's eyes twitched. "I don't have a daughter." "Hi, Dad." Elizabeth stepped out from behind the rack. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding her phone, recording. Frank froze. The gun wavered. "Elizabeth, what the hell are you doing with him?" "He's trying to save the company, Dad. He's trying to save the pension funds, the ones you and your friends rely on." Elizabeth's voice broke. "He's trying to save Leo." "Leo is a lost cause," Frank spat, his face hardening. "I need that money to start over. I gave you everything, and you threw it away for art school and him." He gestured at Jason. "You didn't give us anything," Elizabeth shouted, her anger echoing in the cold room. "You gave us debt. You walked out." "I'm doing this for us," Frank yelled, raising the gun again, aiming it at Jason's chest. "Step away from the console, Thorne. I'm deleting the logs." "Frank, don't," Jason said. "If you pull that trigger, your life is over." "My life was over the day they cut my benefits," Frank roared. His finger tightened on the trigger. Click. The lights in the server room suddenly flashed red. A siren began to wail. "What did you do?" Frank shouted, distracted. "I didn't do anything," Jason said, looking at the screen. Elizabeth held up her phone. "I just live-streamed this whole conversation to the private Ethelgard Slack channel. Every employee, every board member, and the compliance officers just heard you admit to the conspiracy." Frank looked at the phone in horror. "It's over, Dad," Elizabeth said softly. The elevator doors pinged open behind Frank, but it wasn't the police. It was Magnus Vane. Magnus stepped out, wearing a trench coat, holding a briefcase. He looked at Frank, then at Jason. He saw the gun. He saw the red lights. "You idiots!" Magnus hissed. "You triggered the silent alarm." Magnus pulled a taser from his coat and fired. The prongs hit Frank in the neck. The big man convulsed and dropped to the floor, the gun skittering away under a server rack. Magnus looked at Jason. He smiled, a cold, predatory smile. He didn't pick up the gun. He walked to the console and shoved Jason aside. "I don't need to kill you, Jason," Magnus said, typing furiously. "I just need 10 seconds to override your lockout. Then I leave, and the police find you here with a gun and a dead security guard. A murder-suicide gone wrong." Magnus hit enter. Override accepted. "Goodbye, old friend," Magnus said, turning to run back to the elevator. "Wait!" Elizabeth screamed, lunging for him. Magnus backhanded her effortlessly. She flew back, hitting her head against the metal rack. She crumpled to the floor. "Elizabeth!" Jason shouted. He looked at Magnus escaping. He looked at the gun under the rack. He looked at the console. The transfer bar was loading. 98%. 99%. Jason had a choice. Chase Magnus or save Elizabeth. He didn't hesitate. He fell to his knees beside Elizabeth, checking her pulse. The screen behind him beeped. Transfer complete. Magnus Vane was gone, and $4 billion had just vanished into the ether. The sirens were not a distant warning anymore. They were a physical pressure against the walls of Building 77. Red strobe lights from the silent alarm washed over the server room, turning the rows of black mainframes into a pulsing, bloody nightmare. Jason looked at the service elevator. Magnus had taken it up. The police were coming down. He looked at Frank Rossi, groaning on the floor, foam forming at the corners of his mouth from the taser shock. "We have to leave him," Jason said, his voice ragged. Elizabeth touched the back of her head. Her fingers came away red. "He's my father, Jason." "He's the evidence," Jason said, grabbing her arm and pulling her up. "The police will find him. They'll find the gun. They'll find the unauthorized entry logs under his badge. If we stay, we go down for corporate espionage and breaking and entering. If we run, we have a chance to fix the code." "The code?" Elizabeth grimaced, stumbling as dizziness hit her. "Magnus took the money. You saw the bar hit 100%. I saw what he thought was a transfer," Jason muttered, hoisting her arm over his shoulder to support her weight. "Come on, the fire stairs." They moved just as the heavy steel doors of the main entrance burst open. Shouts of "Federal agents, drop it!" echoed off the concrete, but Jason and Elizabeth were already behind the heavy fire door, descending into the bowels of the Navy Yard's drainage infrastructure. They ran, or rather, limped, for a mile through the damp, rat-infested utility tunnels that ran beneath the shipyard. Jason's Italian loafers were ruined, his feet blistering, but his mind was racing at the speed of high-frequency trading. They emerged 40 minutes later, near a rusted chain-link fence in Vinegar Hill. The rain had returned, washing the blood from Elizabeth's hair and the grime from Jason's face. They found refuge in a 24-hour laundromat on York Street. It was empty, save for the rhythmic thrum of tumbling clothes. Jason shoved a folding chair against the door and collapsed onto the linoleum floor next to Elizabeth. "Let me see your head," Jason said gently. He examined the wound. It was a nasty cut, but the bleeding had slowed. He grabbed a handful of paper towels from the dispenser and pressed them against her scalp. "We lost," Elizabeth whispered, staring at the spinning dryer. "Magnus is probably halfway to the Caribbean. My dad is in handcuffs, and we're nobody." Jason pulled the cracked Dell laptop from Elizabeth's backpack. He opened it. "We haven't lost, Elizabeth. Remember the napkin in the diner? The nonce variable?" "Yeah, the floating hexadecimal." "When I sat at that console," Jason said, his eyes scanning the screen as he connected to the laundromat's spotty Wi-Fi, "I didn't try to stop the transfer. I knew I didn't have time to rewrite the destination protocols. So, I attached a rider to the transaction." "A rider? In contract law, it's an additional clause. In blockchain, it's a smart contract dependency." Jason turned the screen toward her. "I wrapped the $4 billion in a localized encryption shell. It's called a dead man's switch." Elizabeth squinted at the code running on the screen. "Wait, you time-locked it?" "Exactly. Magnus moved the money. Yes. It left the Ethelgard accounts, but it didn't land in his offshore wallet. It's currently hovering in a digital limbo, a holding escrow on the blockchain. It requires 2 keys to unlock it before it settles." "Let me guess," Elizabeth said, a faint smile touching her lips. "He has 1 key." "And I have the other," Jason said. "But here's the twist. The escrow expires in 6 hours. If both keys aren't entered by 9 a.m., the money doesn't go to him, and it doesn't come back to me." "Where does it go?" "It executes a burn protocol," Jason said seriously. "The $4 billion gets deleted, irrecoverably. It ceases to exist." Elizabeth stared at him. "You'd destroy it all? Your life's work? Just to stop him?" Jason looked at the laundromat's flickering lights. "Yesterday that money defined who I was. Today I realized it's just numbers. I'd rather burn it than let him win. But Magnus is greedy. He won't let it burn. He needs me. So what do? We don't run anymore," Jason said, standing up. "We hunt. Teterboro Airport in New Jersey caters to the 0.1%. It is a place of silent luxury where private jets idle like waiting chariots. Magnus Vane sat in the leather captain's chair of his Gulfstream G-Lane 50. He was sipping a vintage Dom Perignon, watching the rain streak the windows. The engines were spooling up, a low whine that promised freedom. He opened his laptop to check the Cayman account balance. He expected to see a string of zeros. Instead, he saw a red flashing notification. Error. Incomplete transaction. Escrow lock active. Awaiting key 2 of 2. Magnus dropped his glass. Champagne soaked into the plush carpet. "No," he hissed. He typed furiously. "Override. Admin override. Access denied. Protocol 44B. Thorn Legacy, in effect." He stared at the screen. The money was there. He could see it. But it was behind a glass wall he couldn't break. And there was a timer counting down. Time to burn. 05 AOR 59. 43. His phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Magnus stared at it. He knew who it was. He picked up. "Hello, Jason," Magnus said, his voice tight. "Good morning, Magnus." Jason's voice came through clear and calm. "How's the champagne? A little flat?" "You son of a bitch. Give me the key." "I can't do that," Jason said, "because if I give it to you, you fly away, and I go to prison for the fraud you committed. That doesn't seem like a fair trade." "I have the leverage, Jason," Magnus shouted, losing his composure. "I have the DOJ in my pocket. I have the narrative. You're the fugitive." "And you're broke," Jason countered. "In 6 hours you won't be a billionaire. You'll just be a guy on a rented jet with a stolen hard drive and an angry board of directors wondering where their capital went." Magnus gripped the phone until his knuckles turned white. "What do you want?" "I want a confession," Jason said. "Video. Full details of the Ponzi scheme, the setup, the fake accounts. You send it to the SEC, the FBI, and the New York Times. Once I see the news alert, I'll text you the key." Magnus laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You think I'm stupid? If I confess, I go to jail. If I don't, the money burns. Either way, I lose. Why would I agree to that?" "Because you're a gambler, Magnus. You always think you can wiggle out of the consequences later. But right now, you need the cash to pay off the debts you owe the Russians." "Oh yes," Jason added, his voice dropping an octave. "I saw the subledger on Elizabeth's laptop. You didn't just steal for greed. You stole because you leveraged yourself into a hole with the Petrov syndicate." Silence on the line. Jason had guessed right. "Meet me," Magnus said, his voice deadly quiet. "No meetings? Do it remotely." "I can't," Magnus lied smoothly. "The confession, it needs authentication. My biometric signature is on the secure drive I have here. I can't upload it. You have to come to the hangar. You enter the key, I hand you the drive with the confession and the evidence exonerating you. We swap." Jason covered the mouthpiece. He looked at Elizabeth. "He wants to meet. He says he can't upload the confession." "It's a trap," Elizabeth said immediately. "He's going to kill you the second he gets the code." "I know," Jason said. He spoke back into the phone. "Teterboro, Hangar 4, 1 hour, alone." "See you soon, partner," Magnus said, and hung up. Jason lowered the phone. "You can't go," Elizabeth said, grabbing his shoulders. "Jason, look at yourself. You're exhausted. You have no weapon. He has security." "I'm not going alone," Jason said. "I need you to drive." "Drive what? We don't have a car." Jason looked out the window of the laundromat. Across the street, parked in front of a bodega, was a beat-up 2012 Ford Econoline van, with Mario's Pizza painted on the side. "Do you still know how to hotwire a car?" Jason asked. "You said you had a misspent youth in Queens." Elizabeth smirked, despite the fear in her eyes. "Ford Econoline? I can start that with a screwdriver and a prayer." 40 minutes later, the pizza van rolled up to the security gate of the private airfield. Jason was in the passenger seat, wearing the same sanitation jumpsuit, but he had cleaned himself up as best he could. "ID?" the guard at the gate asked. Jason held up a fake ID card he had printed on a label maker back at the laundromat. It was crude, but confidence was key. "Delivery for Mr. Vane, Hangar 4, special catering." The guard glanced at the clipboard. "I don't have a catering order." "Look, buddy," Jason said, channeling the impatience he used to reserve for junior analysts. "It's a $4 billion flight. The guy wants his pizza. You want to be the one to tell him no?" The guard hesitated, then hit the button. The gate rolled open. They drove onto the tarmac. The rain was driving hard now, turning the runway into a slick black mirror. Hangar 4 loomed ahead, the massive door open. The Gulfstream sat inside, bathed in floodlights. Magnus stood at the base of the plane's stairs. He was flanked by 2 large men in dark suits, private military contractors. "Stop here," Jason said. "Keep the engine running." "Jason," Elizabeth said, gripping the steering wheel. "If this goes wrong—" "When I give the signal," Jason said, staring at the plane, "you drive, fast." "What's the signal?" "You'll know." Jason stepped out of the van. The wind whipped his jumpsuit. He walked toward the plane, his hands raised. Magnus smiled. "The prodigal son returns. Nice outfit, Jason. Is that the new fall collection?" "Cut the crap, Magnus." Jason stopped 10 feet away. The bodyguards tensed, their hands hovering near their jackets. "The confession drive. Show it to me." Magnus reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver USB stick. It's all here. My signed statement, the logs, everything clearing your name. Now, the key. Put the drive on the ground and kick it over, Jason commanded. Key first, Magnus said. We do it together, Jason said. I'll shout the first half of the code. You kick the drive, then I give the second half. Magnus nodded. Fine, proceed. The first 6 digits, Jason shouted over the roar of the wind. Alpha, 7, Zulu, 9, 4, 4. Magnus kicked the drive. It skittered across the wet concrete, stopping halfway between them. Jason took a step toward it. Hold on, Magnus said, raising a hand. The 2 bodyguards drew their weapons. The second half, Jason, Magnus said, his smile vanishing. And don't even think about running. These gentlemen don't miss. Jason froze. He looked at the drive. He looked at Magnus. You were never going to let me leave, were you? Jason asked softly. Of course not, Magnus sighed. You're a loose end, a tragic liability. Disgraced CEO found dead after failed hijacking attempt. It plays well on CNN. Then you don't get the money, Jason said. I think you'll give it to me, Magnus said. He snapped his fingers. One of the bodyguards turned his gun away from Jason and aimed it at the pizza van. At Elizabeth. Give me the code, Magnus screamed, or the waitress dies first. Jason looked at Elizabeth through the windshield. She wasn't cowering. She was revving the engine. Jason looked back at Magnus, and then he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had realized the game was rigged, so he decided to flip the table. You forgot one thing about me, Magnus, Jason said. What's that? I don't care about the money anymore. Jason reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a lighter. The code isn't a string of numbers, Jason yelled. It's a GPS coordinate, and you're standing on it. What? Magnus looked confused. Signal, Jason screamed, dropping to the ground. Elizabeth slammed her foot on the gas. The pizza van roared, tires squealing on the wet tarmac. But she didn't drive away. She drove at them. The bodyguards turned to fire at the van. Bullets sparked off the hood. In the chaos, Jason lunged, not for the drive, but for Magnus. He tackled the other man, slamming him onto the wet concrete. The van drifted sideways, clipping the landing gear of the Gulfstream. The massive jet lurched. You're crazy! Magnus shrieked, struggling under Jason's grip. I'm not a billionaire! Jason shouted, punching Magnus in the jaw. I'm just a guy who wants his life back. The bodyguards were closing in. Elizabeth threw the van into reverse, backing up to create a shield between Jason and the gunman. Get in! She screamed, opening the side door. Jason grabbed the silver USB drive from the puddle and scrambled into the van. Go! 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 Elizabeth floored it. The van fishtailed, speeding toward the open runway. Bullets shattered the rear window, spraying glass over them. Did you get it? Elizabeth shouted, swerving to avoid a luggage truck. Jason clutched the silver drive. I got it. And the money. Burned, Jason panted, wiping blood from his lip. I lied. There was no second key. The timer was fake. The money deleted itself 5 minutes ago. Behind them, Magnus Vane stood on the tarmac, screaming at the sky as his phone buzzed with a notification. Transaction failed. Assets liquidated to 0. Jason looked at the waitress who drove like a stuntman. He looked at the cheap plastic dashboard. He had $0. He was a wanted man, but he felt richer than he ever had in the penthouse. Where to? Elizabeth asked, hitting the highway ramp. The FBI field office, Jason said. It's time to tell the truth. The reception area of the FBI's New York field office was silent until the sliding doors hissed open. Jason Thorne, covered in grease and soot, limped in with Elizabeth supporting his weight. She clutched the silver USB drive like a holy relic. They approached the bulletproof glass. Jason placed the drive on the counter. "My name is Jason Thorne," he rasped, staring at the desk sergeant. "I am wanted for securities fraud. This drive contains the biometric logs proving Magnus Vane is the architect. It's over." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. With the evidence from the drive, federal marshals swarmed Teterboro Airport, dragging Magnus Vane off his jet just as he attempted to bribe the ground crew. The footage of the screaming executive in handcuffs played on every screen in Times Square. Frank Rossi, recovering in the hospital, cut an immediate deal to testify against Magnus. But in the interrogation room, Agent Miller had one question. "Jason," Miller said, sliding a cup of water across the metal table. "We traced the transaction. The $4 billion left the accounts, hit the escrow, and vanished. Where is it?" Jason leaned back. He knew Elizabeth was watching from behind the mirror. "I told you," Jason said. "I initiated a burn protocol. Money doesn't just burn. It has to go somewhere." "It went back to the source," Jason lied, or told a version of the truth. "I didn't delete the money. I wrote a script to reverse distribute the funds to the original ledger entries of the debt Ethelgard had purchased. The housing loans in Queens, paid in full. The small business liens, cleared. I returned the capital to the people Magnus tried to crush." Miller stared at him, stunned. Jason had technically tampered with federal evidence, but he had just bailed out half of New York's working class. "You know you're broke, right?" Miller asked. "Your personal assets are seized. You have nothing." Jason smiled. "I have a place to sleep and a job offer." 6 months later. The sign above the door was new, the Moonlight Bistro. The interior was warm, smelling of roasting garlic and fresh Arabica coffee. Jason sat at a corner table, not in a bespoke suit, but in a simple cashmere sweater. He was typing on a mid-range laptop. "Order up," Elizabeth called from the kitchen window. She placed a plate of truffle-infused grilled cheese on the table. She looked radiant, the stress lines erased from her face. "How are the numbers?" she asked. "Up 40%, Jason said, turning the screen. "And the crypto security firm we run from the back office just landed a contract with the city. Who knew the FBI would hire the guy who hacked them?" The door opened, and Leo walked in, carrying a soccer ball. He looked healthy, his cheeks flushed. The expensive gene therapy was working. "Hey, Jason," Leo shouted. "I scored twice." "Nice work, kid." Jason grinned. Elizabeth sat down, her expression turning serious. "You never told me the whole truth, Jason. You told the FBI you returned all the money. But I ran the math on the burn protocol. There was a remainder, a rounding error of about $2 million. Jason paused. He pointed out the window. Across the street, the St. Jude's Community Clinic had a new wing under construction. "I endowed a research center for cystic fibrosis," Jason whispered. "Anonymously." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. Jason Thorne had lost his penthouse, his jet, and his title. But looking at Elizabeth and the healthy boy at the counter, he realized the truth. He used to be a billionaire with nothing. Now he was a regular man who had everything. Jason's journey proves that rock bottom isn't the end. It's the solid foundation upon which you build a real life. He thought his value lay in his bank account, but it took losing every cent to find his true worth in the courage of a waitress and the brilliance of his own mind. In a world obsessed with net worth, Jason Thorne discovered that the only currency that doesn't depreciate is human connection. He didn't just get his life back, he got a life worth living. And that is the incredible story of Jason and Elizabeth. It makes you wonder, if you lost everything tomorrow, who would be the one to hand you a cup of coffee and save your life? If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about the twisted, beautiful reality we live in. What would you have done with the $4 billion? Burn it or keep it? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.